Good evening, class. I hope everyone's had a wonderful week. To continue on the theme of what we were talking about last week, looking at topics that we like through dissertations, I continued to look at articles about Lincoln's initial pretty much 100 days, that first year in office, and even how his powers extended through. On March 4th, 1861, of course, Lincoln was inaugurated and 7 states had already seceded from the Union. And then a little over a month later, on April 12th, we see the bombardment of Fort Sumter and the official beginning of the Civil War. Within 3 weeks of Fort Sumter, Lincoln's going to issue several measures without congressional approval. Some of these are the blockade of the Confederate ports, the raising of troops and supplies, and also using money that was not appropriated at that time. We also have the suspension of habeas corpus, which will kind of be part of the focus of the two articles that I read this week. And what we see with the suspension of habeas corpus, we're also going to see military detentions. Eventually, these would be extended through the Civil War, and Congress would eventually approve all of these measures after the fact, and this would give Lincoln some credibility with those decision makings and make it a little bit easier for him. But he did face some criticism along the way. The first article that I wanted to look at is called Lincoln, Presidential Power and the Rule of Law by Daniel A. Farber. Daniel A. Farber also writes Lincoln's Constitution, which is a very important book when it looks at how Lincoln handled the Constitution and his powers. In this article, Daniel Farber utilizes a lot of government-related primary sources. He also uses one of Lincoln's major archival sources, which is the collected works of Abraham Lincoln. He also uses a lot of Supreme Court opinions, like the prize cases. He also uses some secondary sources that are prominent throughout American and political science scholars. Forrest McDonald, of course, he used American Presidency and Intellectual History, Mark E. Neely's Fate of Liberty, Abraham Lincoln and Civil Liberties. And he also uses, like Alan C. Weslow, The Fateful Lightning, A New History of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So he uses a lot of the materials that, does it go heavily into the primary sources in the sense of all of Lincoln's archival sources available at the time? No, but he does hit a couple of the big ones. When it comes to content on this article, he's analyzing the constitutional dimensions of Lincoln's wartime actions. He breaks his article down into 2 parts. Part 1 focuses on how Lincoln uses his war powers without consulting Congress, and he's looking at, did it go too far? Basing it off of Lincoln's explanation, also looking at how Taney came at him with the ex parte Merrimon. So he's taking some different angles at looking at that. Part 2 will focus on how the Civil War impacted individual liberties, and he's going to take a special look at the suspension of habeas corpus, and he's going to look in at the run-in with Taney. He'll also look at the military detentions of John Merryman and Clement Van Vallandigham. I'm going to get that name wrong. The article will also relate some of Lincoln's actions back then during the Civil War to the current situation that revolved around the War of Terror between 2001 and present. He's going to display the differences in how presidential authority was used. Looking at 19th century legal procedures weren't as concerned with due process back in the 19th century as they are today. So he's going to compare those, and how he'll also look at how the public looked at it. Public opinion for Lincoln was, at times, it was decent, but there was other times where there was some Democratic newspapers and some Copperhead critics that were definitely against Lincoln, and he kind of looks at that. Farber concludes that executive authority during times of crisis still displays tension between presidential initiative versus the rule of law. He believes political actors, the media, and public opinion can determine whether there will be support or restraint on the president's ability to use these powers. For Lincoln, he was able to use these powers with some critics and some criticism, but he was still able to keep Congress on board, and Congress allowed it for the most part in the Supreme Court, even though they did put up some legal issues with how he used habeas corpus and military detentions. In the end, it did not affect the war when it was happening. The next article that I read during the week was Abraham Lincoln and Civil Liberties, Then and Now, the Southern Rebellion, and September 11. This was written by Frank J. Williams, a Lincoln scholar, a renowned Lincoln scholar. He had a similar approach as Farber in how Lincoln used war powers in time of crisis. Many of the primary sources were similar, especially the collected works of Abraham Lincoln. He also used a lot of court decisions, like the prize cases. He also would utilize a couple extra primary sources, like diaries and letters of John Hay, and that was to help build upon the historical events revolving the Maryland situation, where Maryland was considering as a border state to become Confederates, and there was a lot of unrest in Maryland at that time. And he goes into that a little bit within his article. The secondary sources are also similar. He uses Mark Neely, of course, Fate of Liberty. He will use a little bit of Farber also. So he uses some of that in his sources. So Frank J. Williams, he's a historian, yet he's heavily political also. He is a political scholar at that also. The content and conclusion of this. Frank Williams, he's going to focus on Lincoln's handling of civil liberties, suspension of habeas corpus and military detentions. He's really going to focus on that. He doesn't really he mentions some of the other extra constitutional measures that Lincoln used, but he only brushes them just to build context within the situation, but he does not go in depth with it. He's going to compare the situation of the Civil War with post 9/11, Bush administration, George W. Bush administration policies, and he's going to focus on that extension with the war in Iraq in 2003, and whether President George W. Bush went a little far with that, overextended not only in his executive power use, but also with his support from the general public. Did he go a little too far? So he kind of tries to compare that with how Lincoln was able to, navigate the general public opinion there and keeping most everyone on the same page for the war effort, even though it was hard for Lincoln to do. And he's showing how Bush is going through a similar situation with the war in Iraq at the time. Williams concludes that Lincoln was able to navigate through the Civil War, even though he faced stiff criticism at times. And he pretty much said, and this article was written back in like 2005, so it was a little bit after, but he says George W. Bush's his jury's still out there on whether he is going to be able to navigate it as well. And now that we're in 2020, we know that George W. Bush did. He definitely, the war in Iraq was not, looking back on it, it's not as favorable as it was back in 2003. We of course have the Patriot Act and other things that definitely stymied civil liberties a little bit. But most Americans realized that this time period was a little different than, the act of terrorism is something that, certain radical groups use our freedoms against us. And sometimes, our government has to take actions to try to ensure the safety of all American citizens. So these two articles this week kind of have a similar theme, and they both compare situations from the past 20 years to the Civil War and how presidential power had been utilized in times of crisis. And it's really, both articles are written well and really show how the similarities are there. And there are some differences because the modern presidency has changed and technology has changed and stuff like that. But it really shows that history, there are situations that are very similar that our future presidents can rely upon. They can look at the precedents set from other presidents before them to help guide them in their decision making. Hope everyone has a wonderful week.